I always thought that grief would be the hardest part of losing my grandmother. I never imagined that betrayal would cut far deeper. My name is Jenna Tate, and the story I'm about to share is not just about an inheritance, it's about what happens when the people you call family decide you don't belong. When my grandmother, Margaret, passed away last spring, the world felt like it cracked beneath my feet. She wasn't just my grandmother. She was my safe place. My childhood was scattered and chaotic, a father who left when I was 5. A mother too preoccupied with her own struggles to see me, but Grandma Margaret was always there. Her home was the only place I felt truly wanted. So when she passed, I expected to grieve, but I never expected to be excluded. I remember the day I found out like it's seared into my skin. I was sitting in my tiny apartment after a long shift at the clinic, trying to hold myself together when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my cousin Elise, a group text clearly sent by mistake. "Will reading tomorrow, 2 p.m. at Morrison Parker. Don't tell Jenna." My breath caught. My chest tightened, as if someone had punched me without warning. I reread the message over and over, the words blurring as my vision clouded with tears. I wasn't invited. They didn't want me there. I was erased just like that. The irony was bitter. For years, I had been the one who visited Grandma every Sunday. I was the one who sat by her hospital bed through the long, quiet nights when the cancer made her too weak to speak. I was the one who drove her to every doctor's appointment when the rest of the family said they were too busy. And now, I was being shut out of the very moment that should have honored her wishes. Part of me wanted to walk away, to accept their decision, to grieve quietly, and move on. But another part of me, the part Grandma used to call the fire in your bones, wouldn't let me stay silent. I needed to know what she wanted. I needed to be there not for the money, but for the truth. The night before the reading, I barely slept. My thoughts spun in circles. What would I say when they told me to leave? Would I be strong enough to face them? I kept hearing Grandma's voice in my head, as if she was still guiding me. Stand tall, Jenna, even when the room is cold. The next day, I dressed simply, a navy blazer, dark jeans, the silver locket Grandma gave me on my 16th birthday. Inside was a tiny picture of us baking together, our hands covered in flour, our smiles wide and unguarded. When I walked into the law office, every conversation died mid-sentence. My mother's eyes narrowed in disbelief. My uncle shifted uncomfortably. Elise's face went pale. No one said anything for a long, suffocating moment. "You weren't supposed to be here," my mother finally snapped, her voice sharp as glass. "I deserve to be here," I said quietly, though my heart was pounding. Grandma would have wanted me here. "That's not your decision," Elise muttered, avoiding my gaze. The lawyer, Mr. Franklin, appeared at the doorway just then. He looked between us, clearly picking up on the tension. "Ms. Jenna Tate?" he asked. I nodded. "You're on the list. Please, come in." The family's disappointment was almost comical. They had already started dividing her things, already begun acting like they owned it all. I saw the greed in their eyes, the calculation in their hushed whispers. To them, Grandma was nothing more than assets to be claimed. To me, she was home. As we filed into the conference room, I could feel the weight of their resentment pressing against me, thick and suffocating. I wasn't supposed to be here. They'd made that perfectly clear. But I sat down anyway, because I needed to hear her wishes with my own ears. I couldn't help but think back to all the times Grandma and I sat in her garden, sharing secrets over cups of chamomile tea. She'd told me, once, that people reveal themselves when there's nothing left to gain. "Watch what they do when the spotlight is gone," she had said with a knowing smile. Now the spotlight was gone, and they were showing exactly who they were. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about being excluded from a legal proceeding. It was about being erased from my own story. They wanted me forgotten, written out, discarded like I never mattered. But I mattered to her. I gripped the locket tightly in my palm, grounding myself in that memory, her warmth, her belief in me. I didn't know what the will would say, or what battles lay ahead. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't walk away quietly. This was just the beginning, and no matter what they tried to take from me, I was ready to fight not for the inheritance, but for the truth of who I was to her. I wasn't just the granddaughter they overlooked. I was the one she trusted to remember her story. I thought I was prepared for disappointment, walking into that room, surrounded by faces that once felt familiar, but now looked like strangers. I had braced myself for rejection. I expected them to dismiss me, to act like I was trespassing on something that no longer belonged to me. Part of me even wondered if Grandma's will would mention me at all. What I didn't expect was the silence that followed Mr. Franklin's announcement, a silence so sharp it carved the air in two. When he read my name, I thought I misheard. All of Margaret Holloway's properties, financial accounts, personal assets, and heirlooms are hereby bequeathed solely to Jenna Tate. Solely. I remember that exact word because it crashed into the room like thunder. I sat frozen in my chair, the words echoing in my head as if they belonged to someone else's life. The room erupted. My mother's face twisted in disbelief. "That's impossible," she snapped, shooting out of her chair. There must be a mistake. My uncle's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Elise whispered something sharp and bitter under her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Mr. Franklin remained calm, his fingers folded neatly over the will. "There's no mistake. Your mother, Mrs. Holloway, made her wishes crystal clear. This is the most recent, legally binding document. It supersedes all previous versions." I looked around at my family, their faces flushed with rage, confusion, panic. I could almost see the gears turning in their heads, calculating what had just slipped through their fingers. I wasn't supposed to win. I wasn't supposed to matter. Their eyes screamed the same question. How did this happen? I wanted to shrink away, to disappear from their hateful glares. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty began to rise. Grandma had known. She'd known exactly how they would react. She had planned this. She had chosen me. But why me? Why everything? I wanted to ask, but the room was already spiraling out of control. "You manipulated her!" my mother hissed, pointing at me like I was something toxic. "You took advantage of her when she was weak." Mr. Franklin cleared his throat, his voice firm but not unkind. Mrs. Holloway was of sound mind. In fact, she updated this will after extensive medical evaluations confirming her cognitive health. My uncle slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses. "We all took care of her. We were there." I wanted to scream, "No, you weren't. You were there for the vacations, the celebrations, the moments that looked good on social media. You showed up when there were gifts to collect, when there were deals to be made. You weren't there on the quiet Tuesday afternoons when Grandma needed someone to read to her because her eyesight was failing. You weren't there when she cried because the chemo was making her sick and the house felt too empty. You weren't there when she asked me to bake her favorite lemon cake just because it reminded her of her mother. But I was there. I had been there all along. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, my fingers tightening around the silver locket resting against my collarbone. They kept shouting about fairness, about family, about what they believed they were owed, but I barely heard them. I was trying to process what this actually meant, not just the inheritance, but the weight of her trust, the responsibility, the truth that Grandma had made her choice, and it wasn't based on obligation or guilt. She chose me, not because I was the smartest, the richest, or the most accomplished, but because I loved her without condition. Mr. Franklin passed me an envelope across the table. Mrs. Holloway left a personal letter for you. She requested you read it privately. My hands trembled as I took it, the cream-colored paper heavy with unspoken words. The argument continued to spiral, but I stood up slowly, tucking the letter into my purse. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging around me. "Where do you think you're going?" Elise barked. "I don't need to sit here and fight over what was never yours to begin with." The words surprised even me. They didn't come from anger. They came from something else: resolve, clarity, peace. I walked out of the conference room and down the long hallway, each step lighter than the last. When I reached the elevator, I finally allowed myself to breathe. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about love, about being seen, about being valued for who I was, not what I could offer. I opened the letter later that night, sitting by the window in my apartment as the rain tapped gently against the glass. Grandma's handwriting was familiar, steady, and warm. "My dearest Jenna, I know today must have been difficult. I know they made you feel like you didn't belong, like you were taking something from them. But you're not. You're simply receiving what I always intended for you. Not because you were perfect, not because you never made mistakes, but because you loved me when no one else bothered to stay. You were my home, Jenna, and I hope this will be yours." Tears slipped down my cheeks as I clutched the letter to my chest. I wasn't just the forgotten granddaughter. I was her choice, her legacy, and I was finally starting to believe that I belonged. I always thought I knew my grandmother. I knew how she liked her tea with a splash of honey, how she kept her garden in perfect order, and how she always hummed the same song when she was baking. I thought I knew her stories, her rhythms, her quiet way of moving through the world. But in the days following the will reading, I began to realize I had only seen the surface. Beneath that gentle exterior, my grandmother had been building something far bigger than I ever imagined. She had been watching. She had been planning. The letter she left me was just the beginning. I spent the first night after the reading barely sleeping. I kept thinking about the way my family had looked at me, like I was the villain in their story, like I had stolen something that was rightfully theirs. The weight of their glares still pressed against my chest. But tucked in my purse was the letter that reminded me Grandma had chosen me. She had known what would happen. She had prepared for it. I just didn't know how much. A few days later, I went back to her house for the first time since she passed. Walking through the front door was like stepping into a memory. Everything still smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The house was eerily quiet, but it welcomed me, as if it had been waiting. I wandered through the rooms, my fingers brushing over the worn edges of furniture, the framed photos still resting on the mantel. I could almost hear her soft footsteps coming from the kitchen. Almost expect to see her sitting in her favorite armchair, wrapped in her blue shawl. The silence was comforting until I noticed the gaps. Spaces where her jewelry box should have been. Empty spots on the shelves where her delicate porcelain figurines once stood. her favorite clock missing from the hallway. They had already started taking things. Even before the will was read, they had come here like scavengers, and I wasn't there to stop them. The rage bubbled up in my chest, thick and heavy, but it was quickly overtaken by something else, a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't just about the objects they took. It was about how easily they tried to erase me, to cut me out of her life like I never mattered. But as I searched through the house, I discovered something that shifted everything. In her study, tucked in the back of the old oak desk, I found a small brass key inside an envelope labeled simply, "For Jenna." I knew immediately what it unlocked. In the upstairs bedroom closet, hidden behind the row of winter coats, there was a safe. I had seen it once as a child, but never knew the combination. I thought it held old documents, maybe birth certificates or insurance papers. I never asked. The key slid easily into the lock, and when I opened the door, I found her real legacy. Inside were stacks of carefully organized journals, labeled by year. A small collection of USB drives sat in a box marked backups, and resting on top. A note in her handwriting, "For your eyes, if they force your hand." I sat on the floor right there in the closet and began reading. Each journal was a window into her private world. She had documented every visit, every conversation, every phone call. She had written about my family's empty gestures, the times they only showed up when there was something to gain. Elise brought flowers today, 5 minutes after she arrived. She asked about the lake house. She didn't notice I had switched to decaf. Philip called to check on me, spent most of the call asking about the trust fund and whether I'd consider moving to assisted living to ease the paperwork. She had seen through all of them, and then, in entry after entry, she wrote about me. Jenna came by today. We made lemon bars and sat in the garden until sunset. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to be here. When I was too weak to walk, Jenna read to me. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She stayed. As I flipped through the pages, tears blurred the ink. It was like hearing her speak to me all over again. Like she had built a bridge between us that even death couldn't break. The USB drives were even more shocking. I found hours of audio recordings, casual conversations that, on the surface, seemed meaningless, but revealed exactly who my family had become when they thought Grandma wasn't paying attention. There were even video files. In one, Elise was captured casually pocketing a silver brooch during a supposed quick check-in. In another, my uncle was shown arguing with Grandma about selling her vacation home, growing increasingly aggressive when she refused. And then a final folder labeled legal evidence. She had been ready for this fight long before I knew it existed. I realized, sitting on that closet floor, that Grandma hadn't just left me the house, the assets, or the heirlooms. She had left me the truth. She had seen them for who they really were. She had seen me for who I really was. And she had built this silent arsenal so I could defend not just her wishes, but my own place in her life. In that moment, my grief was joined by something else, strength, a quiet, steady fire in my chest. They thought they could erase me! But Grandma made sure I could never be silenced. The thing about family is that you expect them to protect you, to stand beside you, even when the world turns cold. But sometimes, it's your own blood that sharpens the knives. It didn't take long after the will reading for the attacks to start. At first, I thought the worst was over. I thought the shouting in the conference room was the climax of their anger, that they'd go home, cool off, and accept what Grandma had chosen. But I underestimated their bitterness. Their pride wouldn't let them walk away. They needed someone to blame, and I was the perfect target. It began with whispered phone calls. My mother called my boss at the clinic, framing it like a concerned inquiry. "I just wanted to make sure Jenna's work isn't suffering," she told him sweetly, "because she's been under a lot of emotional strain with everything she's been doing to secure her inheritance." A week later, Elise reached out to one of my coworkers on social media, dropping veiled comments about my questionable tactics and suggesting I'd manipulated a dying woman. It didn't take long for these rumors to ripple through my workplace. People began watching me differently, like they were waiting for me to confirm the stories. Then came the anonymous calls. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, the silence on the other end speaking louder than words. Other times, I'd answer only to hear someone breathing heavily before hanging up. They wanted to rattle me, and they did. But what gutted me most were the personal betrayals. My own mother, filed a formal complaint to the clinic board, questioning my mental fitness to care for patients in hospice, claiming my inheritance dispute was compromising my emotional stability. When my supervisor called me in to discuss it, her eyes were kind but cautious. "Jenna, you've always been one of our best," she said, folding her hands carefully on the desk. "But I need to ask, are you all right? Are you able to continue providing the level of care our patients need?" I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I wanted to scream that it was all lies, that my family was dismantling my life piece by piece because they couldn't dismantle the will. But instead, I sat frozen, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm fine," I said, my voice brittle, barely convincing even to myself. But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. My inbox flooded with emails, some from distant family members I barely knew, demanding their share of the estate. Others, anonymous, calling me a vulture, a thief, a disgrace. Elise posted a thinly veiled attack on social media. It's funny how some people can spend years pretending to care, only to show their true colors when money's involved. I guess family doesn't mean what it used to. The comments underneath were vicious. People I'd gone to school with chiming in, assuming they knew the truth. I started locking my apartment door twice. I changed my phone number. I shut down all my social media accounts. But no matter how many barriers I built, they found new ways to get to me. One day, I found a note taped to my apartment door. Just 3 words, scribbled in angry handwriting. "You'll lose everything." My hands shook as I peeled it off, the paper crumpling under my grip. That night, I sat on my bathroom floor, the cold tiles pressing against my back, and sobbed until my chest physically hurt. I wasn't crying because they had the power to ruin me. I was crying because they wanted to. They didn't just want the house or the money. They wanted to take away the pieces of me that Grandma had protected. They wanted to rewrite the story, so I was the villain. The next morning, I called Maria, Grandma's caretaker, one of the few people who had stood by me. "They're trying to destroy me," I whispered into the phone, my voice raw. There was a pause, then her quiet, steady response. "Your grandmother knew they would. That's why she left you everything you need to fight back." Her words planted a seed inside me. For days, I carried that sentence like a shield. I went back to Grandma's journals, rereading her notes, her careful documentation. I replayed the audio files where she anticipated their schemes. And slowly, a new kind of grief formed inside me. Not grief for my grandmother, I would always miss her, but grief for the illusion of family I'd clung to for so long. I had believed that somewhere, beneath their sharp edges and greed, they still cared about me, that they still saw me as one of their own. But they didn't. I realized then that I was fighting 2 battles, one in the courtroom and one in my heart. I needed to win both, because if I let them take away my sense of worth, my identity, my belief in the truth, then they would have taken more than Grandma's house. They would have taken me. And I wasn't going to let that happen. There's a quiet kind of power that comes when you finally stop running, when you decide you've been pushed far enough, lied about enough, and you're done hiding. I reached that point sitting in my living room one rainy afternoon, staring at the files my grandmother had so carefully left behind. For weeks, my family had waged war against me. They smeared my name, chipped away at my career, and did everything in their power to make me doubt myself. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to walk away. But what they didn't realize, what they never counted on, was that Grandma had given me more than just an inheritance. She had left me the ammunition I needed to fight, and I was finally ready to use it. I called Mr. Franklin, Grandma's lawyer, the next morning. My voice didn't waver when I said, "I have evidence, recordings, journals, inventory lists. I think we need to move forward." There was a long pause on the other end. Then his quiet reply, "Bring everything in. Let's make sure your grandmother's story is told properly." When I arrived at his office, I laid out the journals, USB drives, and a hard copy of the house inventory Grandma had meticulously created, complete with photographs of each item that had mysteriously disappeared after her passing. Mr. Franklin's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment as he flipped through the pages. She documented all of this. Every conversation, every missing item, even who took what, when they thought no one was watching. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is one of the most thorough personal records I've ever seen." Together, we crafted a strategy. The first step was filing a formal complaint with the probate court, attaching Grandma's documentation to prove that items had been removed from her home illegally. The second step was sending demand letters to each family member who had taken property, giving them a firm deadline to return what wasn't theirs. But the most satisfying part, the third step, was preparing to release the audio recordings and videos if they pushed me any further. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. I remember the day we delivered the legal letters like it was yesterday. I sat in Mr. Franklin's office, watching as his paralegal confirmed that the notices had been received. Within hours, the calls started pouring in. My uncle's voice was furious when he called me directly. "You really think you can threaten us? You're not going to get away with this. Jenna." I let him finish his tirade before calmly replying, "This isn't a threat. It's a fact. Grandma knew exactly what you all would try to do, and she prepared for it. You're bluffing. You know I'm not." There was silence on the line, then the dull click as he hung up. It didn't end there. Elise tried to contact me through mutual friends, claiming she was willing to be reasonable if I agreed to divide the estate fairly. She painted it like I was the one being selfish, as if they hadn't spent weeks dragging my name through the mud. But I had learned by then that their version of reasonable meant giving in to their demands. So I stood my ground. Mr. Franklin and I arranged a formal family mediation session. It wasn't required by the court, but we wanted to give them a chance to see what we had collected before things escalated further. The room was tense when we met. They came in confident, smug even. My mother crossed her arms. Elise refused to look at me, and my uncle's lawyer kept flashing condescending smiles like this was just a minor inconvenience. Then we pressed play. On the screen, Grandma appeared, sitting in her sunlit garden, speaking directly to the camera. "My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm recording this on October 4th, fully aware, fully capable, and fully certain of my decisions." Her voice was steady, her eyes sharp. She described in detail the behavior she had observed, who had taken what, who had manipulated her, who had only visited when they wanted something. As each video played, I watched the color drain from their faces. They weren't prepared for this. Mr. Franklin provided them with a list of missing items, complete with photographic proof and written notes from Grandma herself. They tried to protest. Of course, Elise's voice cracked as she insisted. She was confused. She must have been confused. But there was no room for doubt. Grandma had covered every angle. She had filmed the receipts. She had recorded the conversations. She had backed up everything. Their attorney leaned over and whispered urgently to my uncle. After a tense pause, he spoke. "We'd like to resolve this without further legal action." Of course they did. For the first time since Grandma passed, I felt like I could finally breathe. I wasn't the helpless granddaughter they thought they could push aside. I was the one holding the truth, and I was finally learning how to wield it. The thing about standing up for yourself is that people don't expect you to follow through. They think you'll eventually break, that you'll fold under the pressure, that you'll get tired of fighting and quietly step aside. But they didn't know me, not really. And they certainly didn't know how carefully my grandmother had prepared me for this moment. The mediation ended with their reluctant agreement to return everything they had taken from Grandma's house. The terms were clear. They had 2 weeks to return all items listed in the formal inventory, or we would escalate to legal seizure. Mr. Franklin's team made sure every deadline was carved in stone. I thought I would feel victorious in that moment. I thought I would feel like I'd won. But I didn't. Instead, I felt numb, exhausted from months of silent battles, drained from carrying the weight of both my grief and my defense. I wasn't celebrating. I was surviving. When the first delivery truck pulled up in front of Grandma's house, my chest tightened. I watched from the porch as men carefully unloaded boxes and furniture like it was just another moving job to them. But to me, it felt like pieces of Grandma were finally coming home. The antique clock that always stood in the hallway, the one I used to listen to as I fell asleep during childhood sleepovers, was one of the first things returned. I ran my fingers along its edges, worn smooth by years of life, and felt tears sting my eyes. They had taken it like it was just another valuable. To them, it was worth a few $1,000s. To me, it was priceless. Over the next few days, more deliveries arrived. The china set she only used on holidays. The old jewelry box, though much of the jewelry inside was still missing. The paintings that once hung in her living room, each one a quiet snapshot of the places she'd loved. But not everything came back. Some items, like the delicate lace shawl she wore every Christmas, were gone forever. Others, like her personal recipe book filled with handwritten notes and smudges of flour, were never recovered. It felt like someone had ripped chapters out of her story, pieces I could never reclaim. I had won the legal battle, but the losses still clung to me. One afternoon, as another truck backed into the driveway, the driver handed me a small, unmarked package. Inside was Grandma's silver locket, the one she used to wear almost every day. No note, no explanation, just the locket. I knew exactly who had sent it. Elise. Perhaps it was guilt. Or maybe it was a final attempt to silence her own conscience. I didn't need her to admit anything. The locket was home now, where it belonged. As more items trickled in, I realized my victory wasn't just about the physical objects. It was about making them face what they had done. They could no longer pretend they hadn't taken from her. They couldn't rewrite the story to make me the villain. The paper trail was undeniable. The photos, the videos, Grandma's journals, they had all cornered them into the one place they had fought to avoid accountability. My uncle, always the most prideful, refused to return a few pieces of hand-carved chest, some antique silverware, claiming he'd had them for years and they were family heirlooms he had a right to keep. But Mr. Franklin's records told a different story. The chest had been in Grandma's study until just weeks before she died. The silverware had vanished the day after the funeral. Faced with the threat of criminal charges, he eventually relented. The chest was dropped off by a moving company late one evening. No signature, no contact. The silverware arrived by courier in a box lined with bubble wrap. The note inside simply reading, "Satisfied now." I wasn't. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted them to understand what they'd truly lost. What I really wanted was something they could never return. I wanted the version of family I thought I had. I wanted to sit across from them at a dinner table without feeling the weight of betrayal between us. I wanted the simplicity of Sunday afternoons at Grandma's house, before the lines between love and greed had been drawn so harshly. But I couldn't have that! They had made sure of it. And so, I did the only thing I could. I kept moving forward. I carefully unpacked each item as it arrived, polishing the wood, dusting the frames, restoring them to the places where they belonged. I hung the paintings back on the walls. I wound the clock and let its soft ticking fill the hallways again. I placed the china in the cabinet where Grandma had always kept it. Piece by piece, I was putting her house back together. But more than that, I was reclaiming the parts of myself they tried to take: the quiet resilience, the steadfast love, the unwavering connection to the woman who had chosen me to carry her story forward. And as I locked the door behind me each evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Because no matter how hard they fought to erase me, they failed. I was still here, and Grandma's legacy was right where it belonged: home. Forgiveness is a complicated thing. People talk about it like it's this clean, beautiful gesture, a ribbon-wrapped gift you offer to those who hurt you. But for me, it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like grace. It felt like a choice made in the middle of exhaustion, when you're too tired to carry the weight of anger anymore. After all the court filings, the returned heirlooms, the unanswered voicemails, I stood in the center of Grandma's house and realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. Done with the noise, the threats, the endless back and forth where everyone wanted to be right but no one wanted to be decent. I had fought for what Grandma entrusted to me, and I had won. But as I stared at the carefully arranged furniture, the dusted china, the restored photo albums, I realized winning didn't feel as victorious as I thought it would. The house was full now, but it was also painfully quiet. In those moments of silence, I found myself wondering if holding on to the fight was really serving me anymore. Maybe what I needed wasn't to keep winning battles. Maybe what I needed was to let some of it go. But letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean welcoming everyone back with open arms, pretending nothing had happened. No. It meant drawing boundaries that I would not let them cross again, while still offering a narrow path back for those who might one day have the courage to take it. I started small. I called Elise first. When her name popped up on my screen, my stomach tightened. We hadn't spoken since the mediation ended. Her last words to me had been drenched in bitterness. But I answered anyway. She was quiet at first, then blurted out, "I know you probably hate me." I didn't rush to comfort her. I let the silence speak for itself. "Finally," I said, "I don't hate you, Elise, but I'm not pretending this didn't happen." She sighed heavily. "I thought we were doing what was best for the family. I thought we were protecting what was ours." "What's ours?" I repeated softly, not as a question, but as a reflection. I realized in that moment that part of her still didn't understand. The house, the heirlooms, the money, they were never really the point. They weren't the prize. Grandma's love, her trust, her legacy. Those were the things she had divided carefully, and Elise had walked away from them by choice. But something in her voice was different now. Hesitant, maybe even regretful. "I miss her," Elise said, her voice cracking. "I miss the way she used to make those awful oatmeal cookies no one liked except you." I almost smiled. Almost. I thought about all the things Grandma used to say about family, that it's not about perfection or blood, but about showing up for each other, consistently, even when it's uncomfortable. "I'm not angry anymore," I told her, "but things can't go back to how they were." "I know," she whispered. I offered her something small, but meaningful. "If you want. You can choose something from Grandma's things, something that matters to you, not the valuables, something personal." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, almost shyly, "Her recipe box. I don't know if you still have it." I had found the box, tucked behind some old cookbooks. It still had Grandma's handwritten notes, pages stained with oil and sugar, corners dog-eared from decades of use. "I still have it," I said softly. "I can bring it to you." When I dropped it off, Elise didn't invite me in. She just took the box and whispered, "Thank you." That was enough for now. I reached out to others in the family in a similar way. I gave them the chance to choose a sentimental item, a fishing tackle box Grandpa had used with my cousin Liam, an old photo album Aunt Marcy remembered flipping through as a child, a hand-painted tea set that once belonged to Grandma's mother. Some accepted, some ignored me completely. But I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. I wanted to honor Grandma's memory by holding my boundaries, but also by leaving just enough room for healing if anyone was brave enough to seek it. When my uncle sent word through his lawyer that he wanted nothing, that he still believed I had manipulated Grandma, I felt a pang of sadness, but also a wave of clarity. Some doors have to stay closed. Some people choose pride over peace. And that's their choice to make. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about what they deserve. It's about what I need to carry forward without dragging chains behind me. I could live with letting go. I could live with setting limits. And I could live with the fact that not everyone would come with me. Because what mattered most, what always mattered, was that I remained the kind of person Grandma believed in. The kind of person who didn't need revenge to find peace. In the quiet corners of that house, I found something I didn't expect. I found room for both grief and grace. And that was enough. When the storm finally passed, I was left standing in a house that was mine but didn't yet feel like home. The walls still carried the scent of lavender and lemon polish. The familiar hum of the old clock filled the hallways again, and the sun still poured through the kitchen window just like it used to. But something had changed. The quiet wasn't the same anymore. For months, my life had been consumed by fighting to protect Grandma's wishes, defending my name, and wrestling with what it meant to lose both family and the illusion of family all at once. And when it was finally over, I found myself in a space that felt strangely empty. The legal battles were won, the heirlooms were returned, the house was full again. But now, what was I going to do with it? I spent days walking through each room, slowly rediscovering the little things I'd forgotten. The floral curtains Grandma had sewn by hand, the stack of crossword puzzles she never finished, the creaky floorboard in the upstairs hallway that always gave me away when I tried to sneak a midnight snack as a kid. This house wasn't just walls and furniture, it was a collection of stories, layered memories, quiet evidence of a life fully lived. But I realized something else, too. This house had carried Grandma's story for decades. It was time for it to carry mine. Piece by piece, I began making small changes. I kept the original structure, the heart of the house she loved, but I added touches that reflected who I was becoming. I painted the guest room a soft sage green, a color I'd always loved but never dared to suggest. I carved out a quiet reading nook by the sunroom window, where I could sit with tea and lose myself in books just like Grandma used to. I filled the shelves not just with her favorite classics, but also with my own journals, new photographs, mementos from trips I promised myself I would finally take. The house slowly became a blend of us, hers, and mine, past and future. But it wasn't just about the space. It was about how I wanted to carry her legacy forward. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some of her files, I found a folder labeled Dream Projects. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and grant proposals Grandma had never submitted. She had wanted to start a local support program for elderly people with no family to advocate for them. There were lists of potential donors, notes about transportation services, even a rough outline for volunteer recruitment. It broke my heart a little to realize she'd never been able to bring that dream to life. But maybe I could. I reached out to a local community center, pitched them Grandma's vision, and before long, we built something together, a small but meaningful outreach program that connected volunteers to isolated seniors. We named it Margaret's Circle. Every time I sat in those meetings, I felt her there. Every time we matched a volunteer with someone who hadn't had a visitor in years, I knew she would have been proud. I also took a step I'd always put off. I finally traveled to the Oregon coast, a place Grandma had always told me she wanted to revisit but never could in her final years. I walked the shoreline at Cannon Beach, the wind pulling at my hair, the salt air thick and cool against my skin. I brought a small locket of hers with me and let the waves carry it away. It felt right. It felt like a quiet promise kept. I came home with sand in my shoes and a new kind of peace in my chest. Over time, the silence in the house softened. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was something gentler, a space where I could breathe, a space where I could grow. I stayed in touch with a few people from the family. Elise sent photos of her kids now and then. Brief messages that didn't try to rewrite the past but offered small glimpses into her present. My cousin Liam invited me to his wedding, and while the air between us still held the weight of old fractures, there was a tentative kindness there, a willingness to exist in the same room without armor. Not every relationship healed. Some remained distant. Some never responded to my olive branches, and that was okay. I stopped chasing what wouldn't return. Instead, I built new connections, friends who became family, neighbors who showed up with casseroles and stories, community members who knew me not as the girl at the center of a family fight, but as someone who cared about this town, this house, this life. 1 year after it all began, I hosted a gathering in Grandma's garden. Not a grand affair, just people who mattered, volunteers from Margaret's Circle, friends, a few distant relatives who had chosen to stay. We shared stories. We laughed. We planted lavender in her honor. As the sun set that evening, I sat on the porch, feeling the weight of everything that had come before, and everything that was still possible. I had spent so long fighting for the past, but I was finally ready to live in the future. And I realized Grandma hadn't just left me a house. She had left me the space to build a life that was entirely my own. Looking back, I've come to realize that life rarely hands us clear-cut victories. What feels like winning can sometimes feel hollow when the cost is the people you thought would stand by your side. But if there's anything I've learned through this journey, it's this: sometimes protecting your peace means choosing yourself, even when your family doesn't. One of the hardest lessons I had to face is that family can fail you. They can lie. They can disappoint you. They can put their own interests above love. And when that happens, You're left with a choice: either continue shrinking yourself to keep their approval, or stand tall. Knowing you might have to walk alone for a while, I chose to stand tall. I also learned that setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's a form of love. It's loving yourself enough to stop letting people chip away at your worth. It's saying, I see what you've done, and I won't carry that weight anymore. People may call you cold for walking away. They may say you've changed. But growth often looks like distance to those who benefited from your silence. One of the most unexpected lessons was about forgiveness. Not the storybook kind where everyone hugs and makes amends, but the quiet, realistic kind where you let go of the need for revenge. Without opening the door to further harm, forgiveness doesn't always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply deciding you won't let anger build a home inside you. I've also come to believe that legacy isn't about what you leave behind in your will. It's about the love you invest in people and the spaces you create while you're alive. My grandmother taught me that with every recipe we baked, every story she told me, every time she made me feel like I mattered. That's the inheritance I carry with me now, not the house, not the furniture, but the courage to live by the values she passed down. To anyone reading this who might feel trapped in the expectations of family, or burdened by the weight of keeping peace at your own expense, please hear me. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to protect your happiness, to build your own story. Even if it means starting over, you can carry love for your family and still hold firm boundaries. You can walk away from people and still walk in kindness. Your story is yours to write. Don't let anyone else hold the pen.